speaks to so much of what we'll today. This is our book from Rutgers Press. It came out in 2020. It is a case study of Asbury Park, New Jersey. I'm going to start with this work to share with you this recent case study with a specific type of gentrification. And as today's panel description explains, different stakeholders involved. And then I'm going to connect it to what's been happening since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic as well. I think there's some interesting overlaps to what Kwame Holmes shared earlier about like places right outside of New York, outside of the New York City area. So Asbury Park, if you have not been there or don't know much about it, is a small 1.6 square mile seaside city on the Jersey Shore. It is part of the New York City Metro Transit area, so easily accessible by train from New York City. Residents in the area often refer to an east side and a west side in Asbury Park. This picture here is the east side, which is the side closest to the ocean. We began this work because Mary Gatta, my coworker at CUNY, we both work at Gutman Community College at CUNY, and she studies employment and gentrification, and I studied education and gentrification and the lives of youth. And we were just really interested in seeing what was happening in Asbury Park. She lives right outside of Asbury Park. We wanted to know how it's influencing long-term residents, especially in terms of Mary's work area, which is employment, and mine, which is education and the lives of youth. So in the book, we tweaked the more typical, I guess, definition of gentrification for Asbury Park. We use the term seasonal gentrification to describe what is underway in Asbury. Of course, while the term says seasonal, we always say its effects are felt by the community through all 4 seasons of the year. And we define this just as the transition of a low income or working class community to a middle class or upper class community, increasingly composed of second homeowners and vacationers. So what we see and what we explore in the book is how these seasonal homes and businesses cater to vacationers. So we're talking about things like hotels, boardwalk stores, and certain kinds of restaurants. And they're used by incomers more heavily during certain months of the year, which affects all areas of development. So education, employment opportunities, and then like the types of amenities that are open. Incomers differ from longtime local residents in their socioeconomic and racial and ethnic backgrounds. And later I'll share how the seasonal piece is of particular importance in the area of education and, again, the COVID-19 pandemic. So we did 3 years of observational research. I think it's important to note that we turned in our draft of the book on New Year's Eve of 2019. So we did end right before the pandemic, but we've kind of followed up to see what's happening there in Asbury Park. And as I said, I'll talk a little bit about that. We did in-depth interviews and focus groups in the community, given our own race and class positionality, which we examine in the book. We worked throughout to be sure our participants were representative of the community and we were assessing our own positionality. We also worked with a quantitative data specialist and looked more deeply at US Census and other data that's available in the book that I won't get into too much today. So Asbury Park, if you're not familiar with it, you won't be surprised to hear some of the terms that are used to describe it. As gentrification researchers, it is often described as a cool, funky, hip place to visit. In the 3 years that we were doing our research, we noticed it winning even more accolades and drawing more visitors from along the East Coast, but even as far as the West Coast. It is often, described as the coolest small town in America. It's written about in a lot of magazines. And we see this rapid gentrification happening on the East Side, which is, again, the side with the boardwalk and the beach. I have some pictures throughout the presentation that I'll just share today. The quote unquote Renaissance of Asbury Park, which is one of the descriptors that Smith, used 25 years ago, that is still used by the media today. But according to the media, this quote unquote Renaissance, which we know is much more deeply rooted than where they, what they give it credit for, but they would say it began with many LGBTQ individuals buying homes in Asbury and renovating them. So rainbow flags are prevalent throughout the community. And in the book, we really delve deeply into what that media story of the Asbury Renaissance misses, the families and individuals of color and their cultures and community that thrived in Asbury when others stopped visiting as vacationers, the LGBTQ community that was present long before the talk of gentrification, and that now really in particular is facing the effects of gentrification as well. This is an example of housing on the East Side closest to the boardwalk from the official waterfront developer, which is iStar. They come up throughout our book. iStar is a New York City-based real estate firm that took control of all the waterfront redevelopment in Asbury Park in 2009 after a bunch of fits and starts at developing that part of the city. This is the new Asbury Ocean Club, which just opened a few summers ago and has a luxury hotel. So rooms that summer were about $450 to $1,000 a night. And it has condos that run from $897,000 to $5.98 million. In August of 2020, the Ocean Club had the sale of the most expensive home in Asbury Park history. And that was one of those that was listed at $5.9 million. And that was during the COVID-19 pandemic last summer. So we have a quote here from an activist that really gets at the feeling in the community about what the Asbury Ocean Club represents. So he said, gentrification, I think, was probably on the minds of some people, but deep in the background. As that thing rose story upon story upon story, it became very apparent to some that it's going to change the community. And it's a signal that it's no longer a place for me. And there have been articles about all different celebrities looking at real estate in the Ocean Club. It's gotten a lot of press attention. It's just a picture of the beach. Lots of art throughout the community on the east side. So also Asbury Park today, it is the poorest city in the county. It is frequently ranked one of the quote unquote 50 worst places to live in the country. I think it just received that ranking again in the 50 worst places to live. It is a city divided along a railroad track. As I mentioned before, there's a west side and an east side. The west side is largely socioeconomic disadvantaged residents of color. The east side is where we're seeing really rapid gentrification, although there are 4 quadrants in the book and we get into the real estate in each one in more detail. In doing our research, it was apparent that although Asbury is experiencing rapid gentrification on the east side, in many ways, the west side does not feel a part of this. And I'll show some pictures of the west side in a moment. At the same time, the residents on the west side do fear for their ability to stay in the community long-term. The train tracks that split Asbury Park into east and west represent a palpable emotional and social schism. Those are the railroad tracks. And you can see there's not total gentrification of the west side. There's some older development there. Our book traces the roots of the current dynamics in Asbury Park back to its history from its founding in 1871. It was founded by Methodist James Bradley and named for Bishop Francis Asbury. When it was founded, there was a West End, a separate community where Black residents lived. They were not allowed to access the beach during the day, but they were employed throughout Asbury Park. In the second half of the 20th century, we see a similar kind of the disinvestment stage that we talked about earlier this morning, where Asbury Park became synonymous with issues that other cities did as well, such as crime, drugs, and poverty. But we argue that this story really masks the real lived experiences of the people living there throughout that time. Today, Asbury is known for its gay community and as a safe haven for the LGBTQ community. For Bruce's greetings from Asbury Park, its cool concerts at the Stone Pony, that picture there, and great music and food. But there's obviously a deeper, more complex history behind that music scene and those displays of LGBTQ pride. Music didn't begin in Asbury Park with Bruce's albums, and the LGBTQ community was present long before the New York Times started covering that renaissance, right? We really are proud in the book that we try to do a more full history than what the media paints and look at the rich intersectional dynamics. There is, people have talked about Asbury Park and this idea of gentrification, but it's much more complex than that and much more capital than that. And we really look at the ways that the LGBTQ community is particularly at risk of displacement as well, as blamed for it by a lot of locals in the community. We do a lot on employment in the community. We go into great detail about the barriers that West Side residents face in attaining employment, particularly on the East Side, in the hotels and the restaurants and along the boardwalk. We identify a lot of barriers to gaining those jobs in the service economy, although we did find that for younger residents on the West Side, there was more access to employment opportunities, those younger residents who fit into what we talk about, the aesthetic labor that sort of fit the aesthetics of the East Side. But for older residents, the gentrification in the community was not creating increased job opportunities. There's competition from millennials. There's issues around age, and then I have more of the barriers on the next slide. Residents on the West Side face spatial mismatch, racism. There are issues around criminal records and what that means for gaining employment in places, particularly places that serve alcohol or hotels, and then police scrutiny. Let's give you a moment to read that quote. We look at small businesses that are a big part of gentrifying communities, right, but also face their own threats of displacement. We look at and spoke to a lot of small business owners about challenges to hiring local, as well as like reasons that they don't hire West Side residents, and talk about kind of the racial coding of skills that we found, as well as a lot of these small business owners seem to say they had this social justice mission and want to hire local, but faced a lot of challenges in operating their business to begin with, and felt like without a lot more support, there were major challenges to doing more to hire local. And we have a couple case studies in the book too, where we look at local employment programs. And then lastly, for our findings in Asbury Park, the other piece that we really explored was the way it affects lives of West Side residents, and in particular children growing up on the West Side. So there were 4 areas that we really explored there: the beach and boardwalk access, amenities, education, and policing. So one major piece that we heard about right away was the beach. The beach, which people come from all over to experience, is often not experienced by children on the West Side of Asbury Park. Or if it is experienced, it's experienced after the lifeguards go off duty, which is of course dangerous. We write about the impediments to this, but one of them, if you're not familiar with New Jersey, you pay to access the beaches in New Jersey. So that is part of it. While children under 12 are free to access the beach, their parents are not, and 12 and up is not free to access the beach. So that was something that came up when we were doing one of our in-depth case studies. A 7-year-old came in, and we were just chatting with him and asked if he had ever been to the beach. He lived in Asbury Park on the West Side, and he had never been to the beach. So that's something we heard about quite a bit. Families in Asbury often complain that it's an adult playground of restaurants and bars, and lacking grocery stores, a food desert, not enough places for children to play. And they say that that's because this is not who Asbury wants to attract. The fact that seasonal gentrifiers are not invested in the school system also impacts how it is perceived and funded, and that's something I'll get into a little bit more towards the end. But your seasonal gentrifiers coming in are sending their children to school elsewhere. They're coming in on weekends and summers, so they're not particularly concerned about the school system when they're making those purchases, and then perhaps less invested in increased taxes to support the school systems and those sorts of things. Gentrifiers and developers often point to the fact that Asbury Park has a low ranked school system, which those rankings are quite flawed, but often people point to them as evidence that the school system has an issue, but also very, very highly funded. So that is a reason that many small business owners who we spoke to, developers, feel like there's not a need for more funding for the school system. Some people in Asbury that we spoke with actually think there's a goal to get rid of the school system altogether in the community. There's, of course, pilot programs throughout the city, a few, but mainly for that waterfront development, which means no money from there goes into the school taxes. And then lastly, policing is another issue for West Side residents in particular, who feel both that their neighborhood is dangerous, but that they're over-policed and discriminated against. West Side residents really fear for their lives. They feel their lives, bodies, music, and interests are not part of what one interviewee called the production of Asbury Park. But we did also hear from parents who fear for the lives of their children going out and accessing the boardwalk, parents of color, describing, do I have that quote on here? No, but we have quotes. One woman who talked about just even the unequal enforcement of rules on the boardwalk. So should see like young white teenagers, kids accessing the boardwalk on bikes, which is technically against the rules. But then when her nephew was like riding a bike along the boardwalk, was immediately stopped by the police and had a negative interaction that she described. So we're left with lots of questions, and I'd be happy to talk more about them during the Q&A. A big one is, will this remain a safe hub for LGBTQ community, which was something we were doing our research during the Trump administration. So that was coming up quite often as something that local residents were really concerned about, where policy, the direction of our policies, can the funky vibe be maintained? That's something the small business owners want to know. Can it resist becoming another, we heard, quote, Brooklyn on the beach? Can longtime residents and people of color be protected from displacement? And then COVID-19 and how that will affect all of this. So I'll just say a little bit about that. So when we first started, our book came out in, fall of 2020. So in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, and we were really wondering, as many of us, I'm sure on this call, or what was going to happen in terms of urban real estate, evictions, all of this stuff happening. Despite all of the issues in our country, the food lines that were wrapped around city blocks, in the US, the fact that 1 in 6 Americans were at risk of going hungry, the estimated 30 to 40 million Americans at risk of, eviction. What we did see is that second home ownership was on the rise, with real estate at the Jersey Shore soaring. As I mentioned before, the most expensive sale in the history of Asbury Park. According to Redfin, the demand for second homes doubled this October. 8 of the 10 hottest counties for real estate in the country were vacation destinations in the US. And data seems to show that sales in vacation home communities are outpacing other kinds of towns. So I think this is where the kind of seasonal piece became really interesting, because we saw a lot of people from the New York City metro area buying second homes who were not previously second home owners. And then just to spend a couple minutes here, do I have like 2 or 3 more minutes? Okay, talking about the education piece. I just want to talk about how this relates to my other work in the field of education. So for those of you who are not in the field of education, I think it's important to note that gentrification education is really like a growing field in the moment. So when I started attending education conferences, like the big national AERA conference back in 2011, I remember checking the index when we had paper index for gentrification and not finding anything. And recent, AERA conferences, there's lots of panels devoted to this topic. So this is something we're really talking about in the education space. I think it's of particular importance to those of us who look at school integration, because there's this idea that perhaps gentrification could create an opportunity for more integrated schools. But what we do know is that doesn't seem to be happening. As Nicole Hannah-Jones has said, gentrification often stops at the schoolhouse door. So we find that white middle-class gentrifier parents often use school choice or specialized programs to avoid their local neighborhood schools. Or when they opt in, they'll assert their capital to sort of change the local neighborhood school dynamics. My research in this area has kind of focused a lot on school choice and charter schools. So my first book from 2015 was a case study of Hoboken, New Jersey, where I looked at public housing residents. And there I did youth mapping and photography with those residents, the young people, teenagers in public housing, to see kind of how they navigate the city. And I'd be happy to talk about that during the Q&A, but I also looked at why local charter schools, these were charter schools that were very popular with middle-class white residents, and why were they more popular with those advantaged residents than with public housing residents. That led into work I did with Elizabeth Brown, where we kind of identified this type of charter school as a prestige charter school, something we see in different gentrifying communities. And then other work with her where we also looked at how developers play a role in that, and how developers really, in some cases, are supporting these prestige charter schools in their buildings for various reasons, and both prestige charters, but also private schools and preschools. So, and then I just brought this back to the idea of seasonal gentrification in education. So in urban education, we sort of know the challenges that we face in urban ed. That now we're knowing more and more about the challenges we face with gentrification in education. And then I would argue our case study in Asbury Park, we saw this sort of other layer with seasonal gentrification, where we have these second homeowners who are less invested in the school system, amenities, catering to, residents who are there at certain times of the year, and the gentrifiers more than longtime residents and their children. So I just want to end by saying that housing policy is education policy, and integrated schools can't happen or be maintained without that housing policy. So particularly, as we were talking about in the last panel, public housing, and when I look at these communities that are facing gentrification, or in some cases super gentrification, that support and maintenance of public housing will be really important if we want to move towards integrated schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. Applause all around. All right, I'm going to turn it over to you, Brandi. You can unmute.
Great. Thank you. It's still morning here in California, but good afternoon to everyone else who is all around. Thank you, Zawadi, for inviting me to be part of this panel, and thank you to the organizers too. And thanks, Molly, for the context and understanding more recent iterations of gentrification. I am going to do something a little different. So generally, I like to draw on stuff that I've done before, but I'm going out on a limb and going to talk about something that I haven't quite done, that I'm in the midst of doing right now, and hope that during the Q&A we can do some thinking together and, of course, bring these conversations together. So I was thinking about this alongside the terms of Chapter 2 of the Smith book, and thinking whether gentrification really is a dirty word. So I'd say resoundingly, we'd say, yeah, it's horrible. But at the same time, it's really kind of understanding what he was talking about, right? And so there were so many ways that specifically in this chapter, he was thinking really throughout the book about the class dimensions of gentrification, but really race ended up being more supplemental to this analysis rather than it being fully integrated. And so as Smith talks about, the anodyne definitions make gentrification seem like it's progress or modern renewal, right? That's how at least the folks in charge want us to think about it in a way that's less violent. And so he categorizes or characterizes this discussion of gentrification, especially as being introduced in this chapter, as being more forceful in its violence to different communities and different spaces. And so the chapter also really focuses on the origins of the term itself, and brings us nice history to understand kind of where we were, at least particularly in the 90s. And so for Smith, what makes gentrification this modern phenomenon is the systemic nature of urban renewal that started in the mid-20th century, and later urban restructuring that closed out the end of the century. So in a lot of ways, I wanted to really focus on that. I wanted to focus on violence and think more meaningfully about that violence that he leads us to consider and the historical underpinnings of gentrification. So I've written in the past about various practices and processes that take place alongside gentrification, like placemaking, for example, and how urban strategies like placemaking, specifically for marginalized communities, ultimately engender place taking rather than place making, especially when it's combined with the political and economic strategies of gentrification. So now, you know, that I'm moving away from work I'd done previously in Washington, D.C., I'm thinking about my hometown, near where I am, Oakland, California, and I'm shifting to think more about the planned destruction of urban places. So if we think about this in terms of urban renewal, we could see urban renewal as this purposive, demolition of city spaces. And most often, urban renewal, especially in the American context, isn't thought about as, or at least you don't think about it in terms of like war or terror, or at least it's not written that way, on the communities who are most impacted by the annihilation of their neighborhoods. Instead, as David Harvey actually talked about, the meaning of this destruction is veiled behind the political, economic, and cultural processes of creative destruction that end up justifying removal in the first place. And so, like I said, I'm moving to talk about my hometown, which has been a really challenging project because I'm really good at creating emotional distance between things and then writing about them. So to come home and to be able to talk about a place that I know and also don't know at the same time is very tough. So I've been trying to take little nuggets and work through issues. And so I started with trying to understand this longer history, specifically kind of locating some of my work in West Oakland to understand what happened. And so I know how Oakland falls in line with a lot of cities that have large Black populations, specifically as we think about the second wave of the Great Migration, how many Black folks from the South moved to Oakland throughout the war period and after. But Oakland, several parts of Oakland, specifically West Oakland, underwent slum clearance, right? As we think about this in the federal terms. So the implementation of urban renewal strategies in Oakland really was used in the post-war period to combat different kinds of urban death. So if we're thinking about, place annihilation, death, that's what supposedly urban renewal was supposed to counter, a different kind, right? So we had white middle-class Americans being drawn to the suburbs via, of course, the passage of several federal policies that made it easier for them to abandon the urban core and establish communities in newly constructed neighborhoods. And so also, we have the growth of the automobile industry that complemented this rapid development of a highway infrastructure that ended up tarnishing several of the nation's, thriving Black and low-income urban communities. And so these urban renewal projects prioritize accessibility to downtown, specifically for those from the suburbs, and made it nearly impossible for Black neighborhoods to thrive. And so in this case, death ends up being akin to decay, right? As city leaders and policymakers make room for, again, this slum clearance to combat the loss of their tax base and also the spread of architectural blight. So it's like the sickness that plagued cities was thought to be cured through urban renewal. And so again, we see this way that it decimated the housing stock, specifically in Oakland and West Oakland. But also, I think it's important for us to take this opportunity to kind of rethink urban renewal, not simply as a process or an event, but this condition that intentionally brought about, the opportunity to extend precarity, specifically urban life in Black Oakland. Black labor ended up being valuable for the emergence of Oakland as this central industrial power. But once, the state and federal government poured funds into metropolitan regions and also advancing white suburbanization, the industrial urban core was left to decay. And so in its wake, we see this annihilated and polluted urban landscape that ended up being littered with empty lots and unfinished projects. They were literally the industrial carcasses and the scars of urban renewal. And so I want here to emphasize this intentional killing of Black cities, right, via urban renewal that constituted comprehensive strategies of anti-Black state violence. They were literally planned and planning-based herbicide, okay? So the destruction and specifically the disinvestment of Black Oakland through urban renewal, like I said, it constitutes a form of herbicide, which is this term that's used in multiple fields to describe, the forcible and intentional unmaking of urban spaces. So herbicide has both material and discursive meanings attached to it. It refers both to, the destruction of the built environment that ends up, it comprises the fabric of the urban and thinking about also a way of life. So again, in that way, it's discursive as well as being material. But herbicide, it originated as a way to talk about the destruction of historic cityscapes that were caused by urban renewal and redevelopment programs. And again, the original uses of this term, however, in the US didn't necessarily focus on the anti-Black spatial logics that were guiding urban renewal's destruction of the built environment in cities all over the country. But it did, again, have us thinking more about like the architectural destruction and the decimation of different communities. So over time, the meaning and use of herbicide has expanded to include the destruction of the city, communities, and also collective memories. And so since the late 20th century, herbicide has been deployed within the context of warfare and neo-colonial military strategies, specifically in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, with this intent, again, on decimating various networks of resistance. And so really still that in this more newer use of the term, not all the definitions of herbicide have to do with warfare, but they do focus on the material and symbolic destruction of cities. So again, the annihilation of place. So geographer Ken Hewitt actually coined the phrase place annihilation to describe the killing of cities via modern warfare. He was emphasizing, that it was important for social scientists in particular, and he said that to consider just who dies and whose places are destroyed by violence, right? And this is this conversation about place annihilation. And so really then, herbicide ends up being this distinctive form of violence that leads to the destruction of multiple environments, both built and social, as well as experiences. And so I thought about this, and I've been thinking about this as it relates to not only destruction, war, death of cities, but also, well, back to wars, right? So if we think about urban renewal, but then kind of during urban renewal and after various wars. So we have the war on poverty, we have the war on drugs, we have the war on crime. And then if we think, temporally and ideologically, that being consistent with wars in Asia and the Middle East, but specifically our ongoing war against terror, right? And in these ways, it's destroying, these environments that are inhabited. So specifically those that occurred in the 20th century and into the 21st, they're destroying these neighborhoods, they're just destroying the community fabric that exists in these locations. And so even though herbicide is used to discuss warfare, militarized zones, I really think it could be used to discuss what's happened in the United States specifically. And again, going back to how Neil Smith talked about this longer history of gentrification, I'm saying or thinking that it's this destruction that makes way for processes and practices of gentrification and beyond to actually occur in the built environment. So going back to Oakland, the widespread destruction that took place again in Oakland and other locations exemplifies what Catherine McKittrick, she wrote in 2011 about herbicide to explain the intentional death, the decimation, and the decline of cities, and to think about the ways that the extent of colonial relationships served to mark Black people as placeless bodies, justifying our tangible and invisible death in the city that ends up working through capitalist systems. And so she wrote, and actually I think I have a quote, that herbicide, the deliberate death of the city and willful place annihilation can stand in as a viable explanation for ongoing destruction of a Black sense of place in the Americas. And so herbicide then conceptually does draw on various sites, if we think about it in terms of environmental, social, and infrastructural deterioration, but also being related to surveillance. And we can again think about the ways that these various wars, again, against Black people have constituted surveillance and a destruction of the built environment. And we can bring this to more the present, right? As we think about this in relationship to the aftermath of economic crises like the Great Recession. So, these activities, again, can be thought like about wars on poverty and drugs that targeted Black people and decimated Black communities. But then it's like we see these ways that they're justified through the state by using multiple research strategies and statistical analyses to develop comprehensive policy that emptied already disinvested neighborhoods, right? So we have the ways that the state did pledge war against urban crisis, but only ended up creating more war against the people who are being affected by it. And so I don't know what my time is like, but I'm just going to keep talking. So if we think about this more in terms of, place annihilation. So, right, we have place annihilation as surveillance, the police state, and specifically in the Bay Area, something that Maggie Ramirez has written about: gang injunctions, evictions, foreclosures, poverty, segregation, imprisonment, and houselessness, various forms of place annihilation that are taking place alongside the material consequences of herbicide. Crumbling infrastructure, decay, which again leaves room for these shifts in economic policy and urban policy generally. So kind of flipping in ways that I'm still kind of doing work, I want to not only think about negative stuff and get away from my sociological training of always thinking about what's bad, and instead focus on how you can combat the annihilation of Black place with this search for Black collective life, right? So Abdu Malik Simone has talked about this and thinking about Black collective life, but really I'm building on work from Javon Johnson from 2015, who posits that we should really think about Black joy as a potential theory and method and a political device, right? And so I'm thinking about this in contrast to herbicide. So he's proposing that we think about Black joy as both, he says, a real and imagined site of utopian possibility. And so I'm leaning on this theorization of Black joy to think specifically about its spatial politics. I'm thinking about it, specifically in the current existence and aftermath of herbicide as place annihilation, experienced by Black Americans in cities that had majority or almost majority Black populations like Oakland, and probably even thinking about it in terms of DC too, where there's this consistent and incessant eviction and evisceration of Black place, right? And so instead, I want to think about the act of recovery, right? And these ways that Black suffering and Black optimism go against each other, but can produce something that is different than hope, but actually joy as recovery, right? And so the counter to the death of the Black city is bringing life into it and making place for Black life, both materially and discursively. And so I wish I had pictures to show, but there's a festival called the Black Joy Parade. And unfortunately, they weren't able to hold the event last year because of COVID, but they're hoping to have it again. And oh gosh, and I guess this year too. No, they had it in 2020. I went to it in 2020. They didn't have it 2021, but they're planning on having it in 2022. And the focus of the Black Joy Parade is this way of literally making Black place. So there is an actual parade that goes for 2 miles. It was 2 hours, and it's in the central business district of Oakland. And you saw these ways that, quotidian forms of Blackness that end up being in the street, in the central business district, which is a bid. Downtown Oakland's bid has been especially terrible to young Black and Latinx people. And so for them to have this event in that space was really beautiful to see. It was actually also one of the Blackest events I've been to in Oakland in quite some time. And so there was a way that it produced this landscape of focusing on the city's Blackness rather than running away from it. One of Oakland's former mayors talked about the fact that, it was Mayor Kwan, she was pushing against the idea that Oakland was a Black city. And in fact, she wanted to focus more on its diversity. And there was something that kind of just got me in the stomach, because there were so many ways that this city has embraced its Blackness, despite the fact that the percentage of Black people in the city is below 25% now, when it went from a high of 49, 50% down, cut in half so rapidly. And so in thinking about Black collective life, I think it's really, truly important to focus on what a Black city is, even in, its aftermath, that you can still have a Black city when it's not a majority Black city, and what that can mean for building and existing in a space that's useful for everyone, not just the Black people who are being constantly and consistently dispossessed and unhoused, and various forms of violence that the state is enacting upon them. So I would really love to have a conversation, perhaps in our just chat, but also in the Q&A, to think about ways that gentrification ends up being this extension of herbicide from the past, but also ways to combat it even in these small areas. It doesn't have to be this large scale transition. One of the things that I have really been trying to push myself to do is to not necessarily try to come up with solutions, because they end up being fetishized. And so if we can think about various processes to shift a conversation, or even how we gain information, I think it could be useful. And for that, I'm thinking more about, again, Black joy as this analytic to kind of think about various ways and spaces that Black joy can really kind of bring about Black life. So I think that's it.
Thank you both so much for two great, wonderful presentations. So I want to start with some things that I think are common amongst both of your projects and your prior work in this area, which is that, we often see definitions of gentrification that are like, there's a home buyer who enters a neighborhood and they buy a house, and that's the gentrifier, right? And both of you are talking about gentrification as a much more complex process, but also without using all of these like subterms that we've seen emerge in the field, right? Commercial gentrification, studentification, touristification, et cetera, right? So I want to get your critique and input on, how the field has been defining gentrification, and how we need to be thinking about the process in order to capture all of these different kinds of processes.
I can start there if you would like. I think that was definitely even a hesitation in our work of trying to kind of work with this term seasonal gentrification, right? Because there are all of these different terms, and the gentrification of the term gentrification. and seems to just get more and more cloudy with time. But we did, we thought it was helpful to use the term and helpful to talk about it in this way, particularly locally, where we could then, create increased kind of pressure locally amongst policymakers and to really think about how this applied there. It's certainly gentrification is certainly something that most of the policymakers that we spoke to and activists are really talking about in Asbury Park, because they're, very aware of what's going on. They've seen it happen, in many communities nearby. So it was something that certainly, we weren't the first to bring up this idea. They've been talking about it. They've been trying to work on solutions for the two Asburys. We have one quote in the book where someone said, there's so many plans on a shelf. So it was important to us that we were not like trying to come in and create a plan on the shelf and all this new terminology. But we did think it was helpful in discussing our particular case study to have like this other way of looking at it. And then I found it helpful in thinking about the education space as well, and the ways that the seasonality is really different than what we're seeing in other communities that I've studied, and within New York City, where I'm doing current research on integration activism in the schools and gentrifying communities. So, but yeah, I was sort of hopeful for the broader conversation about this today, because it's something that I still struggle with. Like, should we be, trying to parse it out in this way? At what point do we say, no, that's not really gentrification, what you're studying? So I would love to hear feedback on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's right, Molly. I think there are complexities to understanding how we need to use it. So I think generally when we talk about gentrification or have this need to define it, it's more so to measure it. And I get that people want to measure its effects, and therefore need a standard or standardized definition of it in order to do that. I think just in terms of how I like to approach it or have tried is really more so think backwards, like think about its effects and then move to kind of how to define it. And so I think that's what makes place so significant in terms of like how gentrification is, how it was for Ruth Glass is going to be very different than how it exists right now. And so the term has to be malleable in that way, based on location, based on people, based on various contours. So even as like I had started thinking about aesthetics in relationship to like, how do you know gentrification when you see it? Like anybody you talk to on the street has an idea of how they recognize it. Even if they don't know how to define it, they know it when they see it. And so then it's my job to be able to go back and define it or be very clear about its terms, and to put someone's experience in with what's happening at the state level or how developers are contributing to a particular conversation about it. So it definitely, it needs to exist outside of a dimension where we're focusing solely on class and really looking at various logics that hold it together, to where, again, back in the 80s and 90s, developers could say, no, gentrification is a good thing because all it means is that we're going to improve the space. Well, poor people like nice stuff too. So how are you making this a justification for pushing people out when they want nice things, good services? They want to be responded to, when they make a call to the city, right? So it can't just be that. So it's still, it's a moving target from that standpoint.
So following up on that, you both have worked in multiple sites now. So given the complexities, I want to ask a methodological question about how you enter your sites, given the complexities and specificities of place, right, that define how gentrification unfolds. Yeah, whoever wants to start.
You want me to go first, Molly?
Sure, go ahead.
So when first starting to talk about gentrification, I had a chart. I like spreadsheets. And so I had fields, like different disciplines or fields, and then kind of like would dump in what I had read, like, so urban sociologists or planners or geographers or historians, how they had defined it. And then I had to really look at the place, like where I was. So for DC, I had to look at what definitions made the most sense for what was happening in DC during this particular period. And then I think it was in the introduction, I'd write about like how I saw gentrification, but specifically I was thinking about it in relationship to neoliberalism. So there was a temporal component. And so I leaned more on sociologists and geographers to think through kind of what it meant. and then again, how it was impacting people. And then specifically kind of using Black geographies as a context, like understanding how race was really instrumental for us thinking about place and space and ways that my dear sociologists don't do. And so I had to really incorporate that in order to really, again, think more specifically. Now moving to Oakland, like it seems as though we are beyond that. Like it is really difficult to figure out what the hell is going on in Oakland and the Bay Area generally, because we have the impact of the tech boom and ways that it's just kind of like was literally like an explosion. And you see like the capillaries and how it really kind of fits into various areas in the East Bay specifically. So there's got to be something more, not formulaic, but something that's more expansive than thinking about gentrification or it's layering. So going into these different sites, understanding the impact of how international this city is and how different labor markets are being, and with COVID, right? I saw there was a question about thinking about COVID, how COVID is going to not only, you know, impact the fact that cranes were going nonstop prior to the pandemic, but what's going to happen now that people are being fully evicted once the moratoriums end, and ways that building will continue. What stage, are we in a stage? I don't know, like, are we in the 7th stage of gentrification in Oakland? Maybe, like, you know, so still sorting it out. And I think it's one of those things where we actually have to have grace with each other to try, as we are working through these definitions, rather than kind of being very specific about having to focus on this field's definition of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think something that was very important for me in defining it and understanding the local space was really just the empirical research, participatory research, working with, so my first case study in Hoboken, really working with young people in the community on the ground, having them map their community and where they go on a daily basis, having them take photographs of their favorite places in the community. And what I found is that what I heard initially when I started the research from adults in the community, policymakers, didn't always match up to what I found in talking to young people and their actual lived experiences. And I think this also speaks to the way that we define gentrification, often around the aesthetics and the kind of shops and the kind of things that pop up and how that's not going to be popular with longtime local residents. And what I found in my research was like, you know, a lot of the young people in public housing in Hoboken were very happy to have a Starbucks that they could access locally, of course, right? But that was really kind of overstated in a lot of the research I had read before, you know, doing empirical work on the ground. And I think, as Brandi mentioned, the stage of gentrification, while it's hard to kind of put your finger on, is such a part of this. So in Hoboken, I mean, Hoboken was mentioned in chapter 2 in Neil Smith's book, right, as a place that was gentrifying. So when I was in there in, you know, 2010 to 2015 doing research, it was very different stage of gentrification than Asbury Park, where the big waterfront development really began in 2009. And so I felt like what was like the last holdout in that community was really public housing, right? So there was, you know, there's a public housing campus. And when I was doing my research, there's a plan to redevelop it, to tear it down and rebuild. And so really that was of such importance in this community that was at like a later stage in the gentrification process, where in Asbury Park, people are very much like, we don't want it to be Hoboken. We don't want it to be, you know, Brooklyn and some communities in Brooklyn. So that stage, like understanding the stage of gentrification, understanding the local community's understanding of it. And this also has to do with the stage. So in Asbury Park, it came up all the time. Policymakers, activists, developers talk about it all the time, what they're giving back. So iStar in Asbury Park it's called the SALT School, which is an employment program to train employees from the local community to work in the hotels and their, you know, the bowling alley that they have that's also a cafe. So they train locals, which they don't have to be from Asbury Park, from the local area, they train to work in there. So they're very quick to bring up what they're doing, how they're dealing with gentrification, which is very different than sort of like a Hoboken context, where I have sort of a lot of like parents and community members I'm interviewing about gentrification who were not familiar with the word. They've moved in this like later stage and it's not even on the tips of their tongue anymore.
So both of you look at marginalized communities within the spaces that you're studying, which, you know, as Brandi, you noted in your presentation, right, is something that's like not necessarily built into you know, definitions and prior explorations of gentrification, right? So Neil Smith writes this whole chapter about defining gentrification, and like doesn't mention race at all, right? So how do you think about ways in which the field can move forward in better incorporating not just this class focus, but thinking more about different marginalized positions within communities?
I mean, I actually think people are doing it. So yeah, so there are folks who are writing about how thinking generally about if shifts in the urban landscape and the ways that you have to think about race and space together, and the way that you have to think about, right. So there's so in, again, sociologists specifically, some, and geographers, I think, have really been exploring that. And some anthropologists. So like Arlene Davila has talked about that as well. Like we have to, and she's been doing that for a long time. So I think it's who we're centering as having the voice of really kind of authority on these topics. So it's being done. I just don't know if it's being recognized as being done. And I think that those are the kinds of works that should shift the conversation rather than us necessarily, not to say that, of course, this is a pinnacle text. And so it's really important to give a book length treatment on this idea, but also to supplement them or at least even replace them with these different, not necessarily definitions, but really being more expansive in how we're looking at the city in this context, how we're defining what urban is, or even urbanism. So again, I think the work's being done. It's just, we have to recognize it and I guess celebrate it and use it and theorize and think with it and all that good stuff.
Yeah, and cite it. I mean, making such an effort to be sure we're citing the scholars of color who are doing this important work. I think in the education world, it's also a piece, like we've had a lot of research looking at gentrifiers and middle-class residents and their kind of school choice. I think there's now a movement towards looking at, a longtime residents of color and their school choices, and that's it's a different story to tell, of course, and like has all of its complexity that needs to be explored more than it has been, because the focus has really been on like, what are the, how are the new white residents opting out of local schools or using school choice?
And yeah. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
On that, also just not focusing on gentrifiers. So if we could just stop that, that would be fantastic, because I don't know how interesting it is to focus on their intention, and especially if we are focusing on the structural basis of, what's going on, like how this is a continuum, how this just didn't appear from nowhere, and how we really need to think about the impact on people. So me knowing why someone moved into a neighborhood, or the fact that they wanted to honor a particular tradition, it really ends up being useless to me. But that's, again, because I'm trying to understand the phenomenon so we can figure out how to move forward. And changing people's actions and by understanding their intentions aren't necessarily going to get there. But at the same time, it's helpful still to know what the movement is, right? So especially, but there have been a lot of really interesting cases specifically around education. And we see like there will be white middle class, upper middle class families moving into neighborhoods. At first, they don't send their kids, to the neighborhood school. And then it's kind of like, well, we want to take over the school. So what do we need to do in order to kick the poor Black, brown, and Asian kids out in order for us to feel safe in our environment? And there are multiple strategies, that where that takes place, which I think are really important to understand the practices that are used to, displace others. But in terms of why or what they're thinking, that personally, that is something that I don't have as much interest in.
Yeah, I would just add, I found it very interesting in my Hoboken case study when I was looking at the prestige charter schools and why they appealed to one group, that there really hadn't been a discussion about that. Schools had tried to understand why they were getting more applicants from certain demographics than others. But when I spoke to and met with public housing residents, it was really just very apparent that many residents didn't know what a charter school was. There was what I called kind of this charter confusion. Also, I have, a case study in the book where someone talks about how she had dropped kids off, that she worked with at the local charter school had been in there, had actually volunteered at a fundraiser to help out, and didn't know that it was a publicly accessible tuition-free school that her kid could apply to. So I think in that way, kind of investigating why people make the choices they do, but it's of the utmost importance that we're doing it with the residents who are being affected by these policy changes and decisions.
Thank you both. I'm gonna open up to the broader Q&A and stop abusing my powers. Discussant to ask all the questions I want to ask about. So I want to start. Aaron Shakuda asked a couple questions in the chat. Do you want to and you might go ahead?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I just wanted to paraphrase and also give credit to some of my students. So I teach in Princeton, so an hour or so from the Jersey Shore. So it seems I have a very Jersey Shore interested student population. And several of them have kind of looked at the effects of sea level rise and potentially, and particularly what has happened after Superstorm Sandy, when essentially those with access to insurance, those with the ability to take on extra risk, they rebuilt, and you sort of see 2012 as an inflection point in kind of a certain type of gentrification on the Jersey Shore. So I just wanted to ask Molly about that. And then I guess this is just a question I'm going to keep asking over and over again, because essentially it's the question that, at least to me, Neil Smith always raises. I'm always assigning, kind of coming back to the rent gap article and then the New Urban Frontier. One is, a very close-grained case study, and the other is this broad story of the movement of capital. So I'm just also wondering, like, how much of the story of what's happening in Asbury Park is part of this larger, trend that predates, what, Ruth Glass coining the term gentrification of, more and more people moving closer and closer to the beach, right? So I think of Andrew Carl's work on the development of places like Virginia Beach and Ocean City, Maryland. My own students have noticed parallels between Rehoboth, Delaware, and what's happening in Asbury Park. So yeah, two questions: sea level rise, and then also, like, how much of this is particular to Asbury Park and how much of this is just kind of stands in for a broader coastal issue?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. So to start with the Sandy question, and hurricanes and sea level rise took me back for a minute, because I was thinking, well, in Hoboken, I heard about it all the time because it's a big topic of conversation. I was also doing my research there right after that happened, and it has not seemingly affected the real estate costs there and what's happening in the community at all, although it is something people are constantly talking about, that it's going to be underwater eventually, and like long term it's probably not a good investment, but it doesn't seem to be making a change in the short term. I did not hear about it in any of my interviews in Asbury Park, so that's why it was interesting when you brought it up. It's certainly a topic all along the shore. I think probably largely because it's the development in Asbury Park along the waterfront is iStar, the big developer, so less of the residents that we were talking with long-term are individual homeowners, although some were, and some were displaced who were, but that actually didn't come up. But it's it's an important conversation all along the Jersey Shore, and something that would be really interesting to study more in Asbury Park that we did not really hear about much. The question about the shore in general and Carl's work in Connecticut, I think it's really interesting. I think New Jersey, obviously it's a little different in Jersey, where it's public beaches that you pay to access. And I think what's maybe different about Asbury Park than other communities you're referring to, and just like general movement towards the water and the beach, is this idea of the second home. So a lot of the Asbury Park residents, and particularly those who are buying in Asbury Park maybe now, during COVID, are possibly also gentrifiers in another community, right? So we're talking about homeowners in Hoboken or Manhattan or Brooklyn who are buying a second home along the shore. So again, it's like the seasonality aspect of it, which would be true in many of the Jersey Shore communities, but maybe less so in some other places. But I think that piece where you might potentially be talking about, I won't coin another term, but like dual gentrifiers or something here, who have a home in both places and then have that seasonal piece. And in terms of education, would be affecting it in both places, is a little bit, unique to this case study.
I think you should coin that term, and we got to bring Kingston into the picture too, because this is riverfront too. So.
Coin as many, yeah. That's
Derek Hyra, you had a question for Brandi. I don't know if you want me to read it or.
I hope everyone can hear me. I'm like blessed to actually be in a coffee shop. I'm not in my office, I'm not at home. So blessed to hear these presentations and actually be out and about, but the music is very loud in here. The question is not necessarily just for Brandi and Molly, it's for you too. And Molly, you mentioned the people buying second homes related to COVID. Brandi, you talked about all these wars, World War One, and then what we came out from there, World War II, the policies that happened, and then the war on drugs. And so what about the war on COVID? And I'm interested to hear both of you respond to how you think the COVID economic recovery, the trillions of dollars that we are spending, the incredibly low interest rates that we have, may affect the gentrification processes that you are looking at in both your research sites.
Thanks for that, Derek. I've been thinking about COVID specifically, or at least the ways that you can't think about COVID without thinking about kind of the racial reckoning or revolution that's happened at the same time. And though it's, again, one of those things that's been ongoing, thinking about last summer, and every single state in the country had a protest, or at least one, in response to Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and others. And so what's really seeing well, we're still in COVID. We are still in a pandemic. So thinking about the ways that COVID has highlighted how unessential our essential workers are, or at least even categorizing people as being important, but literally showing how they aren't, right? And so it seems as though COVID has opened up the opportunity to look at austerity, to look at various policies that between the Great Recession and kind of this moment we're in right now, to imagine kind of this dystopian landscape that's being produced as a result of people being kicked out of their home. Like, the eviction rates are still wild. We're still having people not able to keep hold on to their jobs. We're still seeing the impact globally, where folks are going on vacation and realizing that hotels aren't at capacity, not because folks don't want to be there, but it's because they're losing staff, not by accident. So there are these ways that we have to account for precarity. And I think that's kind of the thing. Precarity is what we have to imagine, and how we're supposed to measure it, I think is going to change over time. I think folks, there have been all this funding now to do research on COVID-19 as if it already happened. And it's already difficult to do research while something is ongoing. So at least you can take these snapshots and imagine what's happening in these various moments. Maybe it is every kind of blow up, whether it's a political, an election, the ways that Republicans are trying to take away Black folks' rights to vote, like all these ways that we can take a moment in time and think about the conditions around it will have to be the way we look at this. Still though, precarity, understanding how various wars, or at least kind of inhabit a certain kind of violence. The last thing I'll say, like when I came back home, I was overwhelmed by the unhoused, unsheltered specifically population in Oakland, and the ways that it had jumped like exponentially had jumped in terms of the number of people who were on the street. But what was most significant is that 70% of them were Black. And so how we aren't having a conversation about the Blackness of homelessness in Oakland just is befuddling. And so we still have to look at those elements and how COVID-19 is going to impact these communities. We got to talk about race. We have to talk about, yes, class. We have to talk about labor. We have to talk about the environment. We have to think about all these things at the same time. And I think sometimes it's too much for folks to hold it at once. If we kind of take moments, chunks, I think we'll be able to do it. But we're not going to know the impact, I think, for another 10, 15 years.
Yeah, and at risk of centering the gentrifier again here in Asbury Park, I mean, I mentioned during the presentation, but it seems like, second home ownership is on the rise, and Asbury Park, I think what will be interesting to see in Asbury Park is if a lot of the residents who are purchasing shore homes and interested in having a second home end up being able to work remotely long-term, which I think is something that's still kind of up in the air from where I'm sitting. If they can do that long-term, do they end up then staying in that community year round? And then how will that affect the amenities and the lives of youth and the education system and all of those pieces that I'm interested in my work? But I think that remains to be seen. But I do think that this remote work and the ability to work elsewhere, this also kind of plays into Erin's question too about being able to move to the beach and being able to have this second home accessibility for the very wealthy and those like in like the fire industries in New York City to be able to have this second home, and then now to be able to work remotely there, maybe just going to New York 2 days a week. I think it remains to be seen, but I think that's gonna be a big conversation going forward in these communities. I had something else to say. Oh, I'm doing COVID-19 research in the middle of a pandemic. I am doing some Spencer-funded COVID-19 research on a research team around school integration and school integration activism and COVID-19 in New York City. And it has been really interesting to see. It felt like there was like a lot of momentum happening in like summer of 2020, particularly around the dual pandemics and the protests after George Floyd. And like, it seemed like maybe we were really going to see some changes to the school system in New York City and some of the testing and things that create the unequal educational system. And that has really sort of seemed to slow down. And there was a mayoral race and different sides of that. And there seems to be an increasing perhaps amount of support around the kind of the meritocratic means of school admissions back in New York City. But there are other cities that seem to be kind of turning a page on that and maybe moving towards more integrated kind of admission system. So again, we're in the middle of it. It remains to be seen what will happen in New York, but it's an interesting piece to study. And I just think New York and Asbury Park are very different than other places struggling to come out of the pandemic. I was just back home in the Midwest in Cleveland and Akron, Ohio, and it looks very different there than in the streets of New York City and Asbury Park right now.
So our next question is from Willie Wright, who says, peace, Brandi. I'm curious if you are pairing your understanding of urban side or war on the Black city with concepts of war posed by Black organizers over generations, many of whom were clear that the US state was waging a war against Black people, organizations, lifeways. Nixon's policy chief also acknowledged this in 2016. So I guess Willie's asking more about kind of, who you're drawing on and putting into conversation with this idea.
Thank you for that question, Willie. I know you probably can't speak, but through this, but I don't know. So part of it is literally like, this is new work, right? And so I had originally started this project thinking about joy. That was the start of it. And so I'm coming to this parade. I'm trying to understand its legacy, specifically in relationship to the festival at the lake, which would take place in Oakland as well for many years, and how it was shut down and why, and what happened like with Rodney King and all, how that impacted Oakland in terms of it seeming like a dangerous place. And then I was thinking about this in terms of how did we get here, and then this symbolic death of Oakland. So the war component actually came to me a few weeks ago. And so I've been doing some digging, but I really do appreciate that, because there have been ways that specifically with Black organizers in Oakland and those organizations that have existed outside of the Panthers, honestly, because the Panthers get so much attention. There have been so many Black women who have been organizing in Oakland for so many years that are speaking about these ways that, the increase of the and intensity of, the prison industrial complex have impacted what the landscape looks like, where we exist, if we exist at all. So that was certainly something. And then moving it on to thinking about Moms for Housing and ways of taking over the carcasses in order to bring in Black life, where they're literally buying plants and furniture and paying the water bill and all these ways to make it a space of living. So I think I appreciate that question, because it really is going to help me situate the through line and the ways that Black people have been committed to Black life for so long in the face of war, terror, and death, or at least the destruction and place annihilation in the city. So I don't have your answer, but I appreciate you doing that, because I wrote the note and now I'm gonna include it. I'll credit you.
Ariel Bierbaum had a question. I'm glad to read it, or you can jump in.
Sure. Hi. Thank you both for your talks. And I actually, Brandi, I was really taken with how you are centering joy. And I was thinking about how limited we are kind of in our theoretical tools to flip the script, so to speak, and move away from centering gentrifiers. And so the two things that come to my mind are sort of moves in other kinds of policy and disciplinary realms around trauma-informed care and also around reparations. And so I'm curious if those frameworks give us any help or sort of move us analytically, or how that kind of aligns or doesn't with sort of the frameworks of Black joy and Black life that you're bringing to bear on this work? Because I'm so inspired and agree that sort of that we need to stop talking. We're centering around people. And so just curious about your thoughts about those frameworks as additional tools in our toolbox.
Thank you for that question, and for your thoughtfulness and really kind of sitting with it. So my colleague, Javon Scott Lewis, has written about reparations, specifically in light of Jamaica. And so there's a bigger question in terms of what is Black repair? And so not how we get there, but what is it? And is it possible? And what are the terms upon which we are holding it together? And so in some cases, you know, I have, like I mentioned, Moms for Housing earlier, I've really been captivated by that story, not just because, you know, you want them to win, you want them to be able to have a home, and again, focus on Black mothers being able to build community, as, you know, we have for many years, but also really kind of understanding our relationship to property. And so, you know, I think so often when we talk about reparations today, or even think about the impact of redlining or, you know, again, subprime mortgage crisis, it still has to do with holding property or what property means, and it has to do with ownership. And so given the fact that we are on Ohlone land here, and how there are these various layerings of ownership, you know, who belongs, who doesn't, that we actually might have to have a different kind of conversation about what repair looks like for various communities, not just for Black people who have been dispossessed and disinvested and have the homes, spaces, communities disinvested. So I am not usually one who would focus on joy or hope. I am usually the opposite. And so this is me really trying to push myself to think differently, because I found myself in that same depressed state that, you know, I'm looking at a particular history and not necessarily being able to recognize the ways that people have actually been pushing against this for quite some time. If we think about, you know, Black radical activism, if we think about even kind of the more quotidian forms of living, how living is so important and isn't necessarily based on a political movement, but can really just be based in the everyday existence, then it's very powerful. I've told this kind of personal story before on another panel. I don't remember, time is a loop now, but as I was starting to do research in Oakland, I started with my family and just started asking questions, more so like, why didn't y'all tell me about this stuff? Or how come we didn't talk about the Panthers? How come, you know, we didn't discuss Martin Luther King? Like, well, by the time I came around, like, still, we didn't talk about these things in my family and the impact of growing up in San Francisco and Oakland. And so I talked to my grandma, and she said to me, you know, specifically in relationship to the Black Panther Party, she was like, we supported those kids, but they were college kids and we were just trying to raise our families. And so we absolutely participated in the programs and we saw what they were doing and supporting them, but we literally, I was just trying to raise my kids. And that was what I had to focus on. And so to be able to center living in that context, or even forms of joy, or the ways that my grandmother actively did not want to discuss her experiences in Louisiana, I need to pay attention to that. Like, I need to see where we can draw on repair using things that already exist that aren't being centered. So that does go back to this question about not centering the narratives of the gentrifiers, but instead learning to either decode or hear what people are saying. Methodologically, you know, certainly that can include more ethnographic methods, but at the same time, it's like, I think this is an epistemological challenge. We have to learn how to know different things. We have to know how to learn different ways of thinking and not necessarily operationalize it in a way that really kind of silences those who are really doing the work. There's so many ways specifically that Black people, it's not even about overcoming, it literally is about living, like living through such upheaval that there's something there. Like, to be able to live through means that there's something really generative and important to recognize. And I'm trying to do that. And again, instead of focusing just on destruction, I want to understand, again, the joyful components of that.
I would just add that I would definitely welcome a push to embrace like an analytical movement toward reparations, repair, joy, all of this. I feel like the standard question I get when I do any kind of book talks or discussions of my work is like, I'm sure everybody here who's done this kind of work has gotten these questions from a broader audience where it's like, so what do we do? What's the answer? What's the solution? What's the next step? Where is this being done well? Where is this, what is the example you can show us of, what this should look like? And I just always struggle with that question, of course, right? And I have my long list of sort of policy ideas and thoughts and focus on kind of public housing and some of the things I mentioned before. But I really appreciate the push to kind of think about this differently, to think about our methods differently. So thank you. I think that's an awesome question.
And I just want to read, in case our panelists haven't seen the chat, I'm going to just read the next comment, which is from Izetta Mobley, and it said, I deeply appreciate Dr. Summers' encouragement to consider our methods, and more specifically to consider what it means to intensely study gentrifiers, rather than studying the impact on people and communities and the practices that work to displace and enact urban imperialism. So Erin Shikuda added a comment that related to COVID. Do you want to comment more?
Oh, no, it's okay. We can move on.
Okay, but the comment was, I assume this was related to COVID, but maybe a temporary phenomenon, but a few of my students rented Jersey Shore homes to live together with other Princetonians while we were teaching remotely during the fall. A different kind of gentrification.
And I would just add to that, there's also this movement I saw with like residents in Hoboken and the city, right, moving their families out and renting homes and, in other communities, and how that's impacting the housing costs, particularly in rentals.
Yeah, and Janlin pointed to the studentification literature related to Erin's comment. Maya Kearney says, Ruthie Gilmore has a piece called Prisons as Class Warfare that can speak to your ideas on warfare and urbanism. I assume that's a comment to Brandi. Francisco Vieira says, highly recommend Catherine McKittrick's recent work along these themes as well. Are there other questions for our panelists? I think I could the end. Oh, someone added in also Jordan Camp's work on securitization. And we're getting a great list of recommendations and readings here. Monica Bell's anti-segregation policing work, and a link in the chat. So I want to follow up on one question that I didn't ask, which is both of you are studying spaces that local places, right, that are connected to larger regions that have implications for how gentrification unfolds. Can you talk more about how you're thinking about that, and how you connected the pieces of what was happening in the local environment to the broader region, particularly since you're both talking about areas that that's potentially a big undertaking, right, to connect into the larger spaces from the specific neighborhoods and specific areas that you're studying.
I'll just go really quickly, and that's certainly, and I know you're familiar with the Bay Area, so just understanding how there are various networks, and really in thinking about specifically focused on Black residents or Black Oaklanders, where we've gone. Like I have one family member who still lives in Oakland when everyone used to when I was growing up. So it's how it's not affordable, not only to live, but just also in terms of, it doesn't feel comfortable to be in Oakland in a lot of ways. And so I think just in terms of this kind of regionalization, specifically, again, the Bay Area being a cluster of a whole bunch of small towns and larger cities, but then also resisting the temptation to focus on San Francisco because it's a financial center, or again, on Silicon Valley, specifically Santa Clara Valley as being kind of the locus, why Oakland as a mid-sized city is so important to me is to understand kind of its representation. So ultimately, I always tend to fall back on culture, knowledge, and power. Those are the ways that I was trained in graduate school to kind of think about various ideas. And so, and specifically in terms of the knowledge component and how that relates to representation and, you know, Stewart Hall, yay, all of that, it's more so understanding that Oakland is represented in various imaginaries differently than it might exist like in quote unquote reality. And so I'm really trying to grapple more with how it exists. Literally, I can pull data and understand kind of its economic conditions, various social conditions, political conditions, but then also recognize the ways that people come to Oakland as a training ground and think about organizing and thinking about various forms of activism. They get their start in Oakland. They come from other places, come here, and then they leave and they use kind of what they've learned in their various locations. So Oakland is more than just the city. It's more so imagining what the idea is. So it's not as much about the region as it is about what gets made through various representation and various forms of knowledge and power.
Yeah, I think for me, New York City is sort of at the heart of so much of the interviews and the work that I do, because it's always coming up. It's always like, I mean, in a Hoboken case study, and with that, I would say transportation as well. So, right, so it's like the area closest to New York City, whether it's the views of New York City or the transit to get to New York City, and the same in Asbury Park there, where transportation becomes a really huge piece of the story. So it's really, I have been thinking a lot about it lately in talking with people who now, again, to go back to this idea of remote work, who worked in New York City, right, which was kind of the heart of all of these decisions, who no longer are going to go back to work in New York City, and their jobs have become remote permanently. And there's this sudden like realization that I'm hearing where people are like, well, then why would I live here? I don't have to pay to live here anymore because I don't have to go to New York City anymore. So it's kind of a moment of reckoning for people with where they're choosing to live and why are they choosing to live in these places on, you know, like a Hoboken or Jersey City or places right outside of New York City if you no longer need the ease of access to New York. So again, I think, you know, it's evolving, and it'll be interesting to see how people change the way they think about access to a big city and why you would want to live near New York City in particular here. So, yeah.
Well, I said we have one last comment in the chat, which is from Johanna Ladano, who says, it might be interesting to think about seasonal gentrification in global terms, thinking specifically of low-income people who are at risk of gentrification in US cities, acting as gentrifiers in their home countries, in the Caribbean, Latin America, et cetera. Yeah, and that certainly seems relevant for you know, what's been happening with COVID, just anecdotally, right? Like friends going home wherever that is, right? Because they can work remotely, right? And they want to be closer to family given everything that's going on. Yeah. So, any final comments? Yes, go ahead, Mom.
I was just going to say, in the book, we talk a little bit about this idea of tourism gentrification. So ski communities and other places where people have second homes, but that would be an international look at that would be really interesting. And I think, again, relates to this idea of what remote work is going to mean for gentrification.
And this has certainly been the case like with Hawaii and Puerto Rico as well. So I think so often we aren't seeing the context where like, it would be really great if we didn't travel there right now. But there are a lot of ways that there's misinformation, or there don't seem to be in any kinds of, I don't know. I've just been really ornery about travel and going to different places during COVID. So I'll keep that to myself. But yes, I've been.
On that note, I want to thank you both for such wonderful presentations and for being with us today. Our next session is going to pick up again at 3 o'clock, and that's going to be a panel on how gentrification unfolds. So I take a break, stretch your legs, get some caffeine, go to the bathroom, etc. And we'll see you back at 3 o'clock.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. And thank you, Molly. This was great.
Yes, thank you. Learned a lot.